In this video, I'm going to cover some new features I've added to the game, such as ladders, doors, signposts, and plenty more. But before we go any further, I'd like to preface this video by saying, I can't code. Like whatever this is, I can't do that. What I can do is visual scripting through blueprints. For whatever reason, this is just the way that makes the most sense to me. And in this devlog, I'm going to highlight some of the features I've added to the game using this method. I'm also aware there are a ton of assets available on the Unreal Engine marketplace that I could use to make the game with, but I've never been keen on doing that. After all, this is my dream project, and when I say that, I'm not just referring to the final output. I find immense value in creating every asset and feature myself, so I don't want to outsource a lot of the fun. Additionally, I'm concerned that anything I download from the marketplace might not integrate well with the systems I've already built. Now with all that out of the way, I'd like to start by showing you something that makes the game feel a little more Zelda-like. Signposts. I modelled and textured a signpost in Blender, but I was worried it was looking a little too big. I loaded up Zelda to check for the appropriate scale, and I wasn't sure if it was just because I was playing as young Link or not, but the signs were a lot bigger than I remembered. I went to check as adult Link instead, and wait a second, did the sign just grow? Maybe the Kokiri replaced the sign after 7 years? Anyway, whenever you stand in front of a sign and press the action button, a text box will appear. However, it's looking pretty bland at the moment, so let's create a new one that's specific to signposts. That's much better. I've wanted to add doors to the game for the longest time now. I recently overhauled the character model's animation rig, so I took this as a perfect opportunity to test it by making some animations for my doors. I've made 2 unique animations depending on which side of the door the player will be standing on. In Unreal Engine, my door blueprint is using a reference point that the character will snap to so that the animation will play correctly. It will choose the correct animation to play based on some conditions I've set up in the blueprint. I've added camera cuts as the player moves through the door into the next room. This not only makes things feel more cinematic, but it also hides loading of objects between rooms. An additional means for players to engage with the game world involves the use of ladders, as they provide vertical mobility, furthering the scope of my level design. A problem I was encountering when trying to implement this in Unreal Engine was that a lot of tutorials mentioned making duplicate ladder blueprints based on the direction they would face in the world, which seemed very wasteful and inconvenient to me, as I wanted to be able to place ladders at any orientation when designing my levels. My own blueprint ended up being quite a bit more complicated than I had originally anticipated. To spare you a lot of the boring details, I'll just give you a brief rundown of its key features. The ladder BP uses these planes to receive information fired from a trace off of the main character. This determines which angle the player is facing and whether they can climb the ladder or not. Simply put, it means I can place ladders at any orientation within the world, and you'll be able to climb them. The ladder length is controlled via this slider, which can be adjusted to make the ladder virtually any height.
What a thrill, with darkness and silence through the night.
An important thing to note is that the blueprint performs a height check so that the correct character animation is selected as you climb. Please note the hand placement on the left compared to the one on the right. Because the ladder on the right is taller, the animation as the player exits the ladder and climbs back down is mirrored from the one on the left. This is because new rungs of the ladder are added at increments of 40 Unreal Engine units, and at each new increment, the player character's animation needs to alternate. The blueprint keeps track of its individual height so that the character moves properly when they're on it. I'm going to place some ladder blueprints in a new level to demonstrate their versatility. As you can see, the ladders can be scaled to any height to match the dimensions of the level, and placed at any angle to allow for complete design freedom. As long as you move into a ladder, the player will begin to climb it. The input of the joystick needs to be relative to the direction of the ladder in order for it to work. Currently, the player moves at a fixed speed, but I'm planning to make their movement on ladders relative to the input of the joystick. Wow, what a breathtaking view! You can drop down from a ladder by pressing the action button to descend quickly. The camera rotates behind the player if they approach a ladder from the front. I'm really excited about having ladders when designing levels, and I'm hoping it'll add some variety to how you traverse through the world. There are a few more things I'd like to add to the ladder functionality in time, but I think it's in a good place for now. My game's target system has been in some desperate need of improvement. Currently, it is very imprecise which target gets locked onto. You could be facing a nearby enemy, but even so, it isn't guaranteed that what you're looking at is actually what will get targeted. This is because the targeting system is using a sphere trace to pick up enemies within a certain radius. Anything that's within the sphere is eligible to be targeted, regardless of how close it is to the player. This is especially problematic if an enemy happens to be behind something, as currently the sphere has no way to discern whether a target's line of sight from the player is blocked or not. There is also the added problem of being able to swap to a target that is behind a wall as well. My first step toward correcting this was to create a visual indicator for whichever target is currently being looked at, and a lock-on effect for when it has been targeted. I then created some functionality within the enemy blueprint, where each enemy type can be assigned a unique target distance. To illustrate how this works, let's bring in 3 enemies. Pay attention to the target distance in the top left corner, as this shows each enemy's current distance from the player. As I move closer to Blob A, the distance decreases. When it drops below the individual target radius of 600 units, the enemy is then within target range, and an icon will appear above it, letting you know that it can be locked onto. When you move out of the enemy's target range, the lock-on will break. If I target an enemy and another enemy is close enough, you can then cycle between those targets. This new method clears up any ambiguity between what the player is looking at and what will be targeted when you press the trigger. Enemies can also now no longer be targeted from behind walls, and must be visible to the player in order to be locked onto. The target lock will break once the player's line of sight to the enemy has been lost. On the flip side, I was having an issue where the enemy was still able to see the player even when they were hidden behind walls, and would still be able to attack and hurt them. Wow, that was almost worthy of Elden Ring. I fixed this by disabling the enemy's hurt box whenever the player is hidden behind walls. This way, it can't actually damage you when you are behind something, and the enemy will even walk away after a time when they can no longer see you. Large enemies have a much greater target distance than the smaller ones, and can be locked onto when the player is further away. I've added SubTargets that allow you to lock on to specific limbs of the enemy. Let's say if you wanted to sever a leg, you can now focus your attack on that area. The SubTargets can only be cycled to if you're close enough, however, so you need to be near the limb in question if you want to target it. Whenever the target lock has been broken and you retarget the enemy, the lock-on will always be fixed on the center of the enemy and not the individual limbs. You will also cycle from the main target through each sub-target until another enemy is close enough. This works when cycling between enemies, as it would get annoying if you kept selecting a limb first. I think doing this will prevent a lot of tedium in the heat of battle, meaning you won't have to cycle through each individual limb if you just want to quickly target an enemy. This next one is probably my favourite addition so far, and it's something I felt personally has been missing. One of my favourite things about the N64 era Zelda games was the little dialogue box that would pop up whenever you would target enemies. I think it did a good job of fleshing out the encounters and making the enemies themselves feel like they had a greater presence in the game. So I've gone to some lengths to include this feature. Whenever you target an enemy and press the first person view button, the enemy will pause and the camera will do a nice zoom in on them. It's a bit of a cliche to say this, but it really makes it feel more like a game now with this feature included. I liked the way the camera zoom in was working, so I went back and added this to my signpost BP as well. Reading a sign or opening a door will pause the enemy, as I feel it would be a bit unfair to hurt the player while they are in the middle of doing something unrelated to combat. I hope you've enjoyed this update and taking a look at the features I've implemented so far. I'm going to be hard at work on adding some more stuff to the game, so if you're curious to see where I'm at, please consider following me on Patreon where I post weekly updates. If you'd like to keep current with the project, that's the best place to find me. And I'd like to give an extra special thank you to these 64-bit legends for continuing to support the game. LRC Nepkin, Mario Tavolieri, Oliver Honleyken, Yaya Damboos, Mason Stuxberry, Matt Papa, Waro Duck, Multi Metroid, Daniel H. Hernandez, Starkium, Power Hungry Fool, Flash the Reploid, Nicola Wallen, Philippe Bob, Twyla27, Robert M. Stwali IV, Baby Funky Kong, Unseeing Eyes, Void Kitten, Shinku Aura, Zachary Mabius, Eric, Kanzen Sun, Angius, Bo Eccles, Great Mate, Gustav64, A Grumpy Fox, Joel Acklin, Yawning Bear, Ezra Brunziel, Alex McVicker, Zombotic, Cole Warcott, Gnuff, Cassidy, Austin Lindquist, Sock Puppet, I Eat Maths, Something Something, Coldrad, Malachi Sigmund, Sebastian Soderquist, Nehe Ray, Ritzler, Jackie Mars, MMD Lloyd, Cormac, Andy Crew Gaming, Mr. Joey Prozer, Atom Bomb Bryant, Tava, Tyler Renshaw Harris, Hi Parker, Duncan Famel, and Parker Holly. And thank you to my 16-bit patrons as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next devlog.